Thank you, Josette. That was really fantastic. Certainly raised a vast number of issues, and I'm sure a lot of you want to come into the discussion. So we have about another 35 minutes for some questions and answers. Please keep them brief. And as you stand up and ask your question, make a comment, please introduce yourself, your name, and who you're with. Okay? Who wants to start it off? Yes, go ahead.
My name is Usman Badian. I'm the Director for Africa for IFPRI. Thank you for a very inspiring presentation. I have one quick comment and a question. In the case of African countries, and I can speak for the others, but particularly in the case of African countries, most of the changes we've seen in terms of improvement or stopping degradation over the last 10, 15 years has come out of the stronger economic growth process in those countries. Something else that has come up in those countries as well is a very strong drive at the continental level to change the way they're doing business, to improve the policy environment, which actually had inspired the G8 and others to stand behind the efforts of the African countries, i.e. the Comprehensive Africa Agriculture Development Program. And the paradigm has been supporting country-led processes and initiatives and programs. And I think this has been a long-standing position around the G8, and I think even Grow Africa. So I was wondering, the presentation is heavy on what's happening from the global community and from outsiders, and not really very strong on what's happening on the side of the countries themselves. And we do know that it's a bigger macro picture in those countries is really the stronger driving force. Now, was that an oversight, or perhaps did you just choose to focus on what the global community is doing? Because I think part of the shift in paradigm is to stand behind what countries are trying to do, to focus and emphasize positive change and support it, but I didn't hear really enough of it. So how do we see that within Grow Africa, for example, now that WEF, and what's your take on that? Is it part of the change in paradigm? Thank you.
Thank you, Osman. Josette?
Well, I completely agree with you. And Grow Africa, if you noticed on the slide, it had the NEPAD and the African Union and the CADUP process right at the center. And in fact, it's built totally on those principles. And so it really focuses on the countries that have completed the entire process of CADUP, including the investment plan, is the foundation and backbone of it. I was really trying to illustrate here more of the kind of global partnerships, but I think what is critical here is that the nature of the new partnerships that work, all of them that I've shown, are ones that really are country-led, that include not only aid models, but also private sector models, but also farmers and civil society right at the core. And so all of those models put up there have those at the core. And I think we're at a point where any model that does not have the country at the center, the really applied vision of the plan, and a private sector, civil society, and farmer involvement should be revised immediately, because these are the models that work. So I completely agree. And I do want to say that really heroic effort's been done by the head of NEPAD, by Erastus Mowencha, the deputy head of the African Union, and others to really change the paradigm of the ability to invest and grow Africa. And we're seeing pretty dramatic results, I think.
Thank you. Yes, there's a question there.
Thank you. My name is Saskia Westenberg. I'm with IFPRI. With IFED, I'm sorry. I'm at IFPRI. I was wondering if you could speak more to what the incentives are for large private firms to engage in the fight with food and nutrition security. Thank you.
In some ways, I see some of the most innovative thinking coming out of large private firms. that have their own food supply chain. So if you're producing food products and you have to look at the future of food supply chains in a world where climate change, I know one company really evaluated where they'll get their food sourcing in 20 years, and climate change could change access to about 70% of the areas where they're producing right now and accessing food. But I think it's not only that it's in their interest to understand the nature of the global food economy. What I hear from many of the leading CEOs and others who are focused on this, including shareholders of these companies, is that they want to be part of a future where food and the food process is more inclusive and more sustainable. So for these companies to be successful in the future, they need to be able to have the customers, they need to be able to have the suppliers to do so. And I think there's something else happening. I think many companies are realizing that customers want more than just a bottom line. So I've seen some companies move past even the triple bottom line of people, planet, and profits to saying, well, you know, if we put passion there instead of profits, the profits will follow. So you see, I think, a lot of leadership happening because of the connection to customers, the consumers and the suppliers around the world, and social media and the effect that's happening. So I really, you know, if you look at some of the initiatives taking place to make sustainable supply chains, what Puma's doing in a different area, not food, but some of this is coming in and really affecting the food economy. DSM, Unilever, Nestle, all are trying new models. And I will also say that Grow Africa has a big involvement by many African companies, African food companies, that are building, you know, more formal food markets, distribution supply chains to ensure that people can be reached. And I think doing those in some kind of social enterprise model where there's micro-lending to new distributors or using women as the distributors. So it's not just the big global companies, but a lot of the local companies are really using new models to develop out supply chains that really have the investment of women's groups or of local people.
We have two questions here. Terry, could you just get the microphone, please?
Very much. Terry Veman, Professor Emeritus, University of Alberta from Canada. Thank you for your excellent lecture. I guess I would like to see a couple of your imperatives sharpened a bit. I give lectures like this to students, and at the end of the day, the world food problem is not a production problem and not an improved aid problem. At the end of the day, it's a distribution problem, and I guess I would like to see a bit more of a SEN-oriented focus, that the key problem is the lack of entitlements. And that is a difficult issue to come around. India is a good example. They've had pretty strong agricultural growth, a strong food bank for 40 years, and yet many, many poor. So I think central is the need to increase the entitlements of people. You were moved by famine 25 years ago. I was 20 years before that with India. Famine moves us, but chronic hunger is really a problem of the lack of entitlements following SEN. And I think that has to be more central to our message.
Terry, could you pass the microphone to Ruth, right there, in front of you? Maybe take another question. Ruth, go ahead.
Well, thank you very much for an excellent presentation. So my name is Ruth Haug. I'm a professor in development studies at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences, and also a member of the IFPRI board. And my question is to that, being a member of the IFPRI board, and we are going to probably approve the new strategy for IFPRI during our meeting. And I'd like to ask you, what is it that you would like to know that you don't know? What is it that you think research could contribute to, that research has not contributed to yet? I think you gave a little bit of flavor to that when you said that how come we have had 800 million people going hungry for the last 40 years? The number has been more or less the same. Why is that? We have a lot of research findings, but I'd like to ask you to challenge us a bit more. What is it that you think will be crucial to go into the new IFPRI strategy, and what is it that you really think research can contribute to make a difference? Thank you.
Josette, can you answer the two questions?
Well, thank you. Just on the first one, I think we currently have a distribution problem, but I think we also are facing a supply problem, and we are in a post-surplus world. Even now, stocks are low again, and so we are really exiting the luxury of just a distribution problem into also, I think, an absolute supply challenge. And what we saw in 2008 is the multiplicity of competition for food, biomass to be used in many different ways, for animal fodder, for energy, for fiber, and for human use. And those dynamics getting even more intense, the competition for that, but also if we lose one significant crop like the drought in Australia that year, it can have a dramatic effect, and so the more severe weather. So I think we have to do both. On the distribution piece, I think there's two models. One, the entitlement model, the other is markets. And I will just say that one of the areas that would be useful to look at research-wise are new distribution models. You see at very small scale people solving the distribution problems and challenges, whether it's in India or in Africa or in other places, in China, very different distribution models than you see in Western economies. And the ability to learn from these and take them to scale, and you see now today almost every country, every community, every company resolving the problem. And many of these involve, again, empowering women to be part of the distribution chain. Sometimes we think, what does a distribution supply chain, the logistics of food, have to do with ending hunger and malnutrition? But we know it's so critical. On the entitlement side, I would just challenge a bit here. I mean, if we look at the Indian model, which has, I think, about 40 million metric tons of food in it, I don't think, I mean, maybe some of it now is fortified, but when I was deeply involved in this issue, it was basically unfortified. It was not a nutrition concept. And in some of the places, you know, really you see people that are dependent on that food aid really having severe nutrition problems. And so it's the largest food aid system in the world. And I think India just produced a constitutional right to food, which will drive a lot of thinking there, because they take that very seriously. But what is critical there is to solve the content of the food and the nutrition quality of the food issue. That alone could change the Millennium Development Goals. If India can address, through its entitlement program, the nutrition content of the food, you could see a rocking of those malnutrition numbers in the world very significantly because they're so large there. So I would say another area of research is not only to say, well, Brazil is doing something, what is it? But exactly, if you're going to invest government money in a system, how do you create it to be resilient and to empower people to leave the system ultimately? And this is what I like about the Forman program so much, is it really launches people into possibilities of building their own future while it deals with nutrition and access to food. So there's a lot of money in entitlements, even in countries in Africa. I know Ethiopia has done some really innovative models of resilient approaches that rebuild degraded lands. It's something that if IFAD and WFP and FAO have worked with them on, and the World Bank, to really rebuild, have people create their own food security through the entitlements while they receive them. So kind of a food for work with a directed food for assets to rebuild things. So I think that's another critical area, because there's a lot of money pouring into that, and yet the effect is not always the intended effect. everywhere where these programs are, but there's a lot we could learn about that. The other thing I'd like to see is, more research on how to use the byproducts of the food production systems to create nutritious food and access to food. How we reduce that waste and where we invest the money to do so. So if in Africa and India and other places up to 30% of the food is lost post-harvest, capturing that would be key, and we need to know the most effective, efficient ways to do that, and some of it's repurposing the food so that it doesn't perish so quickly. And I think those kind of investments are there. In general, I think we've moved from a phase of really raising awareness, of understanding the level of the problem, of deploying many, many different approaches, of a lot of energy in the global system. And in a way, we need a bit of a pause to say what's working, what do we scale up, and what do we need more information on to do so. And I think we're just really at that kind of very important moment to say, how do we take this to another level, to really a transformative level.
There was a question right there behind. Somebody over there at the back.
Hello, thank you, Ms. Sheeran, for the presentation. My name is David Hong from the One campaign. I had a question, a two-part question. First part is about what is the relationship, and can you clarify the relationship between Grow Africa and the New Alliance? And then the second part is, how do you ensure proper accountability mechanisms for some of these projects? For example, within the letters of intent haven't been made publicly available. Companies have refused to make them available. So how do you ensure that civil society is being a part of the process and that smallholders are actually being included, and what the process is for coming up with those numbers? Thank you.
Question here from Barbara.
I'm Barbara Harris-White. I'm yet another trustee of IFPRI. The title of this lecture was Public-Private Partnerships. For private companies to deliver public obligations to people who are presumably too poor to buy on the market, the state either has to subsidize the company or has to subsidize the customer. And I wonder whether you have ideas on which is best practice out of those two options. Some of your lecture was referring to CSR, and I wonder whether that was the concept of public-private partnership that you are actually advocating, and then what the limits of CSR rightfully are. Thank you.
Let's take the online question, and then
Okay.
we'll give a chance to Josette to answer.
Thank you. I have an online question from Stuart Gillespie, who coordinates the Transform Nutrition program. He asks, given the fractious history of private sector engagement in nutrition, for example, Nestle and breastfeeding, how would you respond to those who consider it is not possible to ensure right to food and nutrition while maximizing profits? He said, we have just run an online discussion of some countries, and this is still a big issue among a minority of actors.
Can you maybe take those three questions, and then we'll take some more afterwards?
I'm just going to try to answer in a more broad sense that I think we're really beyond the era of corporate social responsibility. We're in a world of such profound and shared challenges. And the link between the financial crisis, the food crisis, the energy crisis are so real and present that I'm finding a shift in mindset among any quarter that feels it can wash its hands of the problem, or that the problems aren't real to their own world and their own business. That's kind of change one. I don't find, not every company's enlightened and not every country, but by and large people feel it's their problem too, very much in their context. And so writing a check or doing something without kind of rolling up your sleeves, is not enough. Secondly, I feel the birth of the social media and the online media provides feedback loops to leadership that are very real, that can change credibility and shareholder value overnight. And the interest and knowledge in the entire supply chain is so profound. I know at the World Food Program, if we put out a statement that we have food going to a hill town in Libya, I receive a lot of tweets, and people will say, food's not here, where is it? You know, or it's here, and, you know, or there's not enough, or we need it here. So the feedback loops are quite amazing now with the public, and I think that changes the dynamics. And I think the CEOs of the future will be very aware that their world is very connected and transparent, that they need to do things differently. So I'll give you an example of, I don't know what I'd call it, but for private companies, what to me is most important is a few things. One is, will they share their proprietary knowledge that they've developed for their own for-profit reasons? Great. That can dramatically transform the lives of those who would never have access to that. So for example, WFP tried to make this lipid-based food for a few years, and the oil and the protein kept separating. And I remember going to DSM and Unilever saying, I have a problem, I can't, and they're like, that's easy. I said, it's easy for you, and they helped to stabilize that. So the type of research, whether it's in warehousing capacity or perishing of food, all of that is very critical, and I find companies in a much different mindset about their willingness to share. Secondly, you know, I don't know if it's subsidies so much as the fact that 100% of the growth for most companies in the world will come in the emerging markets. And those require new models of doing business, new models of distribution, new models and approaches. And so you see a lot of companies investing to understand markets and to understand how to work in new places in new ways. And the old models don't just transfer at all. And so I see many making the kind of forward investment to understand, you know, what those new models are like and how to work there. And some of that knowledge is very beneficial, and some of it really benefits from a social enterprise kind of model, especially again in production and distribution of foods. On Grow Africa, the new alliance was set up by the G8. It is to bring them together with a new vision. Grow Africa is one of the projects of the new alliance, and one of the projects that contributes to that vision, but is separate and does its thing, started by the World Economic Forum under the new vision for agriculture. And the model of Grow Africa is very much one that is that you there? Yeah, hi. Civil society, governments, and experts and companies working together to create win-win type of investment. So what I've liked most about the model is that it puts the countries in the driver's seat and puts the models of CAADP and NEPAD really at the forefront of Africa itself. And so countries define where they need investment, and that's where the investment appeals go, and then working with an array of companies globally and elsewhere to almost matchmake with those investments. In those investments, the FAO voluntary principles of quality investment are at the heart and center of that process, and I think that's very important because what we want to see is long-term sustainable investment that is transparent and win-win. Now, these models that really look at the connection between civil society, companies, and countries really are new, and they'll continue to be perfected as we go along. And I think, but very promising, launch to the model.
Thank you. I have a question there. Yes.
We have two questions from online viewers. The first comes from Twitter. It's Esther Ngumbe, and she asks, how do we engage the youthful generation in generating solutions to combating hunger in the 21st century? And the second comes from Professor Refugio Roquin. He's at UC Davis. And he asks, is there a trade-off between innovation in agriculture and protecting traditional farming and culture? And does innovation mean transformation that reduces values and beliefs in traditional smallholder farming?
We have one more online question, yeah.
I have another online question from Purnima Menon from our New Delhi office. What can you say about the current state of the evidence of the impact of private sector engagement in nutrition or undernutrition? What is the discourse like around the evidence issue? Experiences in breastfeeding and obesity in the US are quite negative, for example, and corporate interests have trumped public health interest in many cases on those issues. What safeguards must be put in place?
Thank you. I will say that the innovation loop has to feed both ways, from the experience of big players, but also some of the most innovative approaches I've seen has been on smallholder farms, born in countries, and I think the respect for those models and bringing them forward and seeing where they can apply is very, very critical. In fact, the smallholder farmers that I meet around the world, that's all they do is innovate. They're dealing with so many challenges and problems. They have to adapt. And one of my pet peeves is when people say, you know, you shouldn't feed a man, you should teach him how to fish. You shouldn't give a man a fish, you should teach him how to fish. And I rarely find a smallholder farmer who doesn't know what to do if they have the tools. And so really, I think the focus should be on how to empower smallholder farmers to who know the soil and know the challenges and partner with them with knowledge about soil health and knowledge about that IFPRI and others in the system, research system bring. And the aflatoxin ban, for example, in Africa is very, very critical. And smallholder farmers cannot tackle that on their own. How to deal with endemic aflatoxin in the soil and how to deal with the fact that some of the foods, you know, just really are not up to human standards. So I think this partnership at the macro and micro level are very critical. Esther from Georgia, hello. Esther is a fabulous, passionate PhD advocate for ending hunger, and I think soil scientist and expert. I will just say that what Auburn University is doing in leading universities against hunger is fabulous. I love the 4-H club, all over the world, by the way. They're fabulous. These are young people on fire to try to create solutions for hunger. And if you present them with a challenge, such as, you know, children in one climate without a product that can bring them the nutrition they need, I've seen them take this on like a, you know, with a passion. And so, you know, looking at, you know, the difference between a sweet potato and a white potato and how that can challenge that and how to teach farmers, you know, how to design crops that will also end malnutrition. I want to thank IFPRI for their work with the research institutes on planting the right crops. In some countries, if we simply plant a sweet potato instead of a white potato, we're going to really address malnutrition at a bigger scale than other more complicated interventions. So, and I will just say overall, I think the crisis of 1 billion overweight people in the world and 1 billion undernourished and 1 billion overnourished, you know, really is a judgment upon all of us about how we address this challenge. And I think shifting the focus of the world from disease management to wellness, raising awareness of what it takes for people to lead a healthy life, including at the corporate level, is critical. And it's one of the areas that I've really put my attention in the world, in my work at the World Economic Forum and elsewhere, is how do we create a dialogue around wellness? How do we create principles of wellness that companies will sign on to? How do we change our approach? Because again, this no longer is an isolated problem, it's hitting everybody. And so we see in some countries people going from malnourishment to being malnourished while they have too much food, because the knowledge of traditional nutrition is lost. And I want to commend, for example, the example of Japan, which now something like 1 out of 5 children in Japan has a pre-diabetes condition. But in school, at their school meal program, the oldest school meal program in the world, it's a course in school. And children have to design the meal, and and if they don't get the balance of nutrients right, then they don't pass the course, or they get a bad grade, and those meals they design are then produced in the school and delivered as a school meal. This type of education from the beginning, and then looking really for an effort to come together and make standards globally that we all agree, if you want a good housekeeping seal of approval as a company or as a country, that we sign on to those. I think the time has come to really start that dialogue in a big way.
Do we have room for one more question? Quick one. Right there, yes, please.
Thank you. I'm Kaba Joyner. I'm a pediatrician. I'm a pediatric neurologist. I was fascinated with your slides, particularly the one about the brain, showing the marked shrinkage in the first 3 years. I think this is where we need to commend the first 1,000 days, because the first 2 years of life in the child, when it comes to nutritional issues, is terribly important. I got into nutrition because as a pediatric neurologist, I saw a lot of kids with spina bifida. And the solution was folic acid to the mothers. And I do commend the part you talked about, improving the nutrition of mothers, particularly during the pregnant period. I was also fascinated by what you call the circular approach to addressing hunger, and your illustration with the food for immunization and good grades. I think this is an illustration of the collaboration that you need between health, nutrition, education, and agriculture. I think this collaboration is necessary to address the point that you made about the circular approach to addressing hunger. I wonder what you think about, you talked about changing, revising policy and subsidy models. What policies would you revise? What models would you revise to address this issue of a circular approach to addressing hunger?
Thank you, Kaba. Josette?
I guess the approach I would take is similar to the approach taken after World War II or post-independence, which was, to really look as if things were new. And in World War II, after World War II, there was so much hunger and starvation throughout those nations affected by the war zone, and new policies needed to quickly be put in place to change that and to secure, the access to food. It was then, that the Marshall Plan, the concept that peace cannot be built on an empty stomach, and the need to really secure that. So you saw a lot of the subsidies regimes and policies put in place by countries that now are food secure, but were not at the time. So the level of hunger and even starvation in Europe and Japan and China and elsewhere during that time was, so severe. You look at the shift of the economies of Africa and elsewhere when independence came, and the supply chains were really cut. I mean, what we don't really know, what we haven't really fully understood is the impact of those food and input supply chains also that were really directed during the former colonial relations. And so, sometimes in Africa you'll see a border that really does not work, where people are hungry on one side and there's a supply, but the trains only go between countries that used to have a formal colonial relationship. So it's even down to kind of the way that supply chains work, or Central Asia, where the supply chain was built all facing northward, and now they could supply food to Afghanistan or Pakistan, but the supply systems don't work that way. So I guess the way I would approach that is to say we need to kind of look at, if there was nothing in place, how would you build it now for the type of world we face now, with the type of challenges we face, and really look at how you build food security, what kind of policies would do that. Because I think if we just focus on kind of taking everything that was built and what do you tweak and what do you change, we end up getting into, kind of stuck in, more the, who wins and who loses and the politics of that, rather than saying, if we were to build a food secure world, if we were to really get these numbers going in a different direction, if we were to ensure that even nations that right now, feel food secure, but would all be affected if the food supply is at a net deficit. And we saw that in 2008, whole countries being unable to access adequate food. Then what would that look like? What would the elements of that be? And I guess I would suggest that, having been in food policy debates for decades, that it would be a useful approach just to step out of it and really look at what types of approaches would be most effective, and then try to bring that vision and knowledge back into the system and see how it can inform where we go. One thing that's true is that the old structures, which are really inefficient for the current day challenges, are really expensive, and the financial crisis is putting pressure on systems that are really quite costly and don't necessarily build a long-term balanced approach to food security. And so the opportunity might be there, just given all those financial challenges, to really think, how do we do this more effectively and efficiently and better? I may be dreaming, but why don't we dream about the types of approaches and thinking that at least could inform us to make the choices that we make? Right now, if we were to say, what would we choose over all this kind of mismatch of policies built up over decades for different reasons and purposes, I don't know that we'd know. And it would be useful to know some of the ideas that would be new thinking. I am struck that if you look at the internet and its explosion and the way that it's been able to adapt to our times much more differently than our structures of governance, our policies, it's been unburdened by decades of track record on it. And so the high efficiency and capacity of the internet to reach people at every level around the world, and my most active Twitter friends, most of them are from Africa and elsewhere, villages all over. They share their stories and what they're doing and what they're accomplishing and the challenges they have. I mean, amazing how democratizing the internet is. Well, we need that kind of ability to think, I think, about our food economy in a new way also.